Have you ever suffered in silence in the postpartum period, not knowing who to tell or how to tell that you were suffering? Did your baby feeding plan ever make your suffering worse? My guest today shares her experience of suffering from perinatal mood and anxiety disorders that actually led to her being hospitalized only 5 days after giving birth to her first baby. And she's able to share this in such a way that shines such a light in so many of the systemic barriers that lead to this type of suffering. So whether you are a parent that has experienced postpartum mental illness or you are a provider that works with families, if you are able to tune in to this type of story, because of course I want you to take care of your own mental health, I hope that you can listen to this story and think about how you can be the person who helps other people to see their situation for what it really is. And I hope that we can all look at each other and help them to see how they can take care of themselves more fully instead of just focusing on the baby. Because of course, we can't take care of our children if we are not fully taking care of ourselves. So I hope you enjoy this difficult yet beautiful story. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to my podcast, The Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding struggles and triumphs through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
My name is Maggie. I am originally from upstate New York near Albany, but I went to college in Manhattan and I lived there subsequently for about 10 years. And that is where I had my first child, my daughter Eleanor, and that was in 2019. And I also now have a son named Sage, who is just about 7 months. And my partner's name is Scott, and we moved out of Brooklyn to Beacon, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley. It's about an hour and a half north of Manhattan on the Metro North. We moved after we had our first, and after the pandemic hit, it just felt like it was time to get out of the city. And people often ask if I miss it, and I have mixed feelings. I think my first reaction is typically no. I recently was talking to someone who also moved out of the city not long ago, and he said, I am also a recovering New Yorker. And I really liked that because I do feel that even though it's almost 3 years since I've been out of the city, my body is still relaxing and letting go a bit from the craziness of New York. Yeah, I think what I do miss is like some of the spirit of the city and the spirit of the people that live there. So yeah, I guess that's a bit about me. Yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing my story here.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can understand that the duality of needing to leave a place and also feeling a deep connection to what a place offered you for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so as we think about your baby feeding stories, I want to take you way back to as far back as you can remember and think through your upbringing, how you were surrounded, what your earliest memories of other people feeding babies were, and tell me about any exposures you had to baby feeding. Did you associate baby feeding with bottles as a kid? Or did you see examples of people feeding babies from their bodies? What was that like for you growing up as a child and then as you entered adolescence and then into your 20s?
Sure, yeah. So I think in terms of baby feeding, the first memory that comes to mind is being about 6 years old and giving a bottle to my younger sister. I remember my mom used formula, and she used those bottles that have a bag in them that you can
Mm.
put the formula in
Oh, yeah.
and then replace it, which I imagine was useful for her having 4 children. I'm the third of 4 girls. So, yeah, I remember doing that. I don't remember seeing her breastfeeding. So, I don't think I was really introduced to the concept of breastfeeding until my oldest sister had her first, and she exclusively breastfed all of her children. She has 4 kids now, including 2 twin boys. And yet it seems that breastfeeding for her came very naturally. There may be parts that I didn't see, but from what I did see, it was just very easy for her. She just breastfed no problem, didn't have seem to have many issues. And so I guess from that perspective, it seemed like the natural way to go for me. But I didn't really think about what it was going to look like for me until I became pregnant. And then I just assumed, oh, yeah, I'll breastfeed. That's how it goes. That's what you do. And then my other older sister also exclusively breastfed both of her children. And yeah, I think the only issues that I saw her have was trying to get her daughter to take a bottle. She had trouble with that. So, yeah, I remember being pregnant and reading a book about nursing, which is not super, at least in my experience, helpful to read about nursing because you can't really experience it until you do it. And yeah, I guess that's it from that perspective.
Yeah. What is the age difference between yourself and your older siblings?
So I'm about 6 years younger than my oldest sister and about 3 years younger than my second oldest sister.
Okay. And when they were feeding their babies, were you getting an up close and personal view to that? Or it was just like they were off doing that and you saw that they were doing it, but you weren't seeing the struggle that sometimes comes with it too?
Yeah, I would say I wasn't super up close and personal in the process. It was more like, oh, yeah, they're doing that and they're not having any trouble. And it didn't even really cross my mind at the time, having no kids and not being pregnant yet, like to even inquire more about what it was like. It was just, that's how it goes and that's what you do. And I didn't even really have much curiosity around it now that I think about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And do you remember which book you read?
I think it was The Nursing Mother's Companion.
Hmm.
I think that's what it was called. But yeah, I remember being about like 38 weeks pregnant, like about to pop, and just bringing that book to the park and sitting there looking at it and trying to process what it was saying and just not
Mm.
not being able to take much away from it.
Did you ever relook at that once you had your first?
I didn't I didn't really feel that I had the capacity, honestly, to
Yeah.
read a book.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Right. Yeah. And did you do any other prep in pregnancy to prepare for baby feeding specifically? Take a class or go to a prenatal lactation consultation or anything like that?
I took a birth class. It was about 6 weeks, and I don't remember them covering much around feeding, which you'd think
Wow.
maybe that would be an important topic.
Hmm.
Maybe there was, like, 1 session on it, but even that, I don't really recall them getting into it. I think a lot of the focus was on labor and delivery and how to track your baby's diapers and things like that, but it didn't get into much on the feeding end of things.
Yeah. So you had this idea that you would just breastfeed your kids, did you have any goals about how long that would be or hopes for that?
I was a fairly young mom, I guess you could say. Let's see, I think I was 27 when I had my first. And I think there was a lot of naivete around the whole ordeal in that I got pregnant and didn't really think through what it was going to look like. It was more just focused on delivery. Am I going to get an epidural? Am I not? What is that going to look like? And a lot of focus on making sure the area in our tiny Brooklyn apartment where the baby would be was like impeccably beautiful and organized and, you know, different baskets for all the different things and it looked beautiful. But like the reality of bringing home a baby, I don't think had set in. So in answer to the question, like, I didn't think through what it would look like. I think I just assumed I would breastfeed and that it would be easy and that would be it. I didn't even set up my pump, so I had no idea how a pump worked or like how to use it. It was just in the package
Mm,
and that was a mistake.
mm,
So if anybody is pregnant and listening and you have a pump, get it out now.
yeah, play with the buttons.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. So, were you planning on going back to work at a certain time?
I was. Yep. I was at the time working at Slack in recruiting. And
Hmm,
yeah, the plan was to go back to work after about 6 months of maternity leave, which is quite generous for
mhm,
this country.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, so then knowing all of this prep work and your
This is
cultural
non prep work.
it's you can't every person is just making the next right step. Like you said, you can't really know what it's gonna be like to bring a baby home, and so we can't really judge our past selves for what we didn't know. Given this all this background and knowing whatever you know about how birth can impact baby feeding, go ahead and tell us then what you think your birth experience had on the that early breastfeeding.
Yeah. So let's see. I think maybe a week before giving birth, I read another book. Clearly, I had a lot of time on my hands
Mhm.
then. I read Ina May's Guide to Natural Childbirth, which is a series of stories that women share of their experience with a natural birth, meaning no epidural, no
Interventions.
interventions. Thank you.
Mhm.
And that book, I think, really is what allowed me to then go on to have a birth with no interventions. Again, going in, I thought that's what you do because that's what my mom did, that's what my sisters did. There was almost some shame or judgment that I picked up on around things like getting an epidural. And so I felt very determined to not do that. But had I not read that book, I don't think I would have been able to do it. So what I took from that book is going into birth with the mindset that you are allowing this process to happen to your body rather than doing anything to make it happen. So it's about letting go of resistance and letting this force be with your body and do what it needs to do to birth the baby. And so that was probably for me the first time in my life that I had let go in that way and let a greater force take me. I had spent a lot of my life, my whole life, trying to hold on to control, trying to stay safe. And so that process really opened up for me a lot of unprocessed trauma. that then came up shortly after giving birth. So, yeah, I guess the birth process, how did it affect the subsequent feeding? I came into it having labored for 8 hours with no interventions and no support from a lactation consultant because the person who was there on the unit was just so overwhelmed that she didn't get a chance to come to my room before I left. So I wasn't able to get the baby to latch in the 3 days that I was in recovery.
Oh, no. So what were you doing?
I was just trying to get her to latch, not really sure what it was supposed to feel like, so thinking maybe I was having success when really I wasn't, feeling really quite abandoned by the support staff because the hospital I gave birth at was just so busy. And the room that we had for recovery was a shared space,
Mm,
and the other patient in the room was having like a really hard time after a very traumatic birth. And so there were doctors and nurses coming in and out the entire time.
mm.
And our space just kept getting smaller. Like the curtain kept closing in on us, and I didn't get any sleep at all. And so when it came time to discharge, suddenly the nurses became aware that I hadn't really successfully fed the baby for the whole 3 days, and suddenly there was, like, kind of panic, and it was like,
Mm.
"We need to get you on a triple feeding plan," and,
Oh, no.
um Yeah. Yeah, so I remember leaving the hospital feeling just completely overwhelmed, feeling like I was failing my child, feeling like she was in, like, dire danger of not surviving. I was very concerned, and I, again, didn't feel like I had any real guidance on how to breastfeed. And I went home with this triple feed plan, and so for anybody who's not familiar with that, essentially, you are supposed to try to feed the baby on both breasts. I believe it's like for 30 minutes each. And then you're supposed to pump for an additional 30 minutes. And this is supposed to happen every, I think, 3 hours. And so what
And
ends
then
up happening,
feed the baby,
right,
which
feed
is
the,
the third part of the triple.
right, because
Mhm.
the baby may or may not have gotten anything from the attempted breastfeeding. So then, yes, you're supposed to feed the baby after the pumping.
Mhm.
So you end up being up for like an hour and a half to 2 hours each feeding, and then you try to fall back to sleep, and then we were supposed to set an alarm to get up every 2 to 3 hours. And so what ended up happening is that we didn't get any sleep to a point where I would try to lay down to sleep and I couldn't because
Mhm.
I was so anxious about the feeding, and that in addition to the hormonal shifts that happen after giving birth, as well as what I spoke about earlier, the sort of unprocessed trauma had been released from my body and started manifesting in symptoms of postpartum OCD, which is basically having like disturbing intrusive thoughts of harm coming to the baby
Mm.
and not knowing what that was, feeling even more terrified. So we had these symptoms of postpartum OCD, insomnia, obsessiveness about trying to get the baby to feed, and eventually the lack of sleep leading to like auditory hallucinations.
Mm.
So,
I am so sorry.
thank you. Yeah. It's quite a story as I tell it. I'm reminded of how challenging it truly was. So, about 5 days of this went by, and we were supplementing with formula because the breastfeeding was not going well. Looking back, my daughter likely had a tongue and lip tie. I think that's what was contributing to her not being able to latch. And at the time, I just felt like I was failing.
Of course. Yeah.
I was like, this is the one thing you're supposed to be able to do. Like, your one responsibility as a new mom is to feed the baby. And I
Mm.
couldn't do it. And being somebody who easily finds success in life when I try to do something, I was really not used to feeling like a failure and feeling like I couldn't get something if I just worked hard enough.
Mm.
And also, every time my husband would say, okay, it's not working, I'm going to give her formula.
Mm.
Every time he would give her that bottle, I was just crushed. I was
Mm.
absolutely crushed. And I it felt like if I don't breastfeed this baby, like I'm just like I said, I'm just failing.
Mm.
And I don't even really know where I got it in my head that breastfeeding was the only way, but the tunnel vision that I had around that was just really intense. I
Mhm.
don't know if it was like a societal thing with the breast is best thing or just having seen people in my family breastfeed so successfully with no trouble, but I had a lot of trouble letting go of the need to breastfeed.
Are you having trouble letting go of your best laid baby feeding plans, whatever they are? I would love to work with you to shift from guilt and shame to self care and understanding about the systemic barriers that have gotten in the way of your baby feeding hopes and dreams. I can work with you in person or virtually. Just reach out to me at www.quabbinbirthservices.com. You don't have to suffer alone, and whatever is going on truly isn't your fault.
And I think I've done a lot of work to let go of that guilt, and I've had a much healthier approach with my second, and I'm very
Mm-hmm.
thankful for that. But yeah, in terms of what I needed in leaving the hospital, the triple feed plan was very much designed to hyper focus on the need to get milk production up and get the
Mm-hmm.
breastfeeding going. Whereas had someone said, even if you supplement with formula, you can still get back to breastfeeding. It's not like you have one chance and it's over. I believe someone told me that there are cultures that actually purposely start out with formula for a short time and then they switch because that allows the mom to get some rest and recuperate before she has to get into that rhythm of breastfeeding. And I think what I needed somebody to say was, you need to prioritize your care because you cannot care for the baby if you are not okay. And what does that look like? You need to remember to eat. You need to remember to sleep. If you don't eat and sleep, you cannot function. Or perhaps the lactation consultant or one of the nurses could have said, I see that you're very distressed about this. You're
Mm-hmm.
crying,
Mm-hmm.
you're anxious. Here are some mental health resources you can reach out to if you're struggling with those things. And another thing would have been so helpful to have a list of potential mental health symptoms that are very common that you
Mm-hmm.
may experience. And if you experience them, here are some places you can call. The only thing I got was if you have any thoughts of hurting yourself or your baby, go to the nearest emergency room. Now, I understand out of an abundance of caution that is what people are told to do. However, for me, was extremely detrimental because we went to the ER in Brooklyn, and there was not one mental health professional in the entire hospital. So I was there about 5 or 6 days of not sleeping, like I said, hallucinating, just like screaming because no matter how hard I tried to sleep, I couldn't. And they started treating me for preeclampsia because I had high blood pressure. which I didn't have preeclampsia. I was in mental health crisis and I needed drugs to put me to sleep so that I could sleep. And it took, I think, something like 48 hours of just continued begging on the part of my husband for us to be cared for by a mental health professional before finally somebody came in and gave me Ativan to sleep.
Oh my God.
And so I would say that was probably the most traumatic part of the story because I felt so helpless and powerless in a system that just didn't see me and didn't have the capacity to help me. And yeah, from the ER, I was transferred to Zucker Hillside, which is in Queens, I believe, which is a psychiatric hospital that supposedly has a maternal unit that's dedicated to moms that are struggling. The reality was it was not, there were some patients there that were pregnant or postpartum, but it was also just patients that were struggling with anything. There were people in the hallway that were screaming, and I my husband came with me and they said, "Okay, he has to go home now. So say goodbye." And so I was alone. It was a Friday, so it was going into the weekend, which means they didn't have any psychiatric staff there available to meet with me. So it was about 3 more days of just being alone in a psychiatric hospital, separated from my 5-day-old baby
Mm.
and my family, still hearing voices, still not knowing what was happening to me. And I think the only thing that sort of got me through that time was the fact that my husband, before he left, wrote down on a piece of paper something like, I love you. You're doing all the right things.
Mm.
Like, we're going to get through this. Some sort of message that I just kept reading over and over again
Mm.
to get me through to that Monday when I was finally able to meet with a psychiatrist who asked me a lot of questions. And it turns out it was acute postpartum OCD and sleep deprivation.
Mm.
And I do think a lot of the fact that I ended up in that state of crisis was kicked off by the breastfeeding and the
Mhm.
not sleeping.
Mhm.
And so I was there for 10 days and I wanted to pump. I would keep track every 3 hours. I would ask for the pump, and it was challenging to get it because you needed someone to be with you when you were using it, and they were understaffed. And so I had to really advocate for myself to be able to even get to use the pump as much as I needed it.
Because they were
Um,
worried about the cords or
yeah, yeah. I had, I think, 2 visits with my daughter during
Mm.
that time for about 30 minutes each visit.
Mm.
And looking back, as as painful as that time was being away from her, I do think that is what I needed. I needed a place where I could sleep, eat good meals, and rest so that I could have the capacity to care for her when I returned home. But I think when I was released, I didn't have the support in place that I needed to navigate this mood and anxiety disorder that I had been diagnosed with because the care options for PMADs, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, are few and far between. And so I ended up finding a therapist that took my insurance but was not equipped to handle the symptoms that I was sharing. I was terrified I was going to hurt my baby. I didn't
Mhm.
trust myself around my baby. And I later learned that, like, the very presence of that distress was an indicator that I didn't have any intention of actually hurting my baby. It was simply the OCD that was scaring me into thinking that. But this first therapist that I saw didn't have any experience in this, and so she became afraid that I was going to do something, which then further,
Oh,
you know,
no.
yeah, further made me even more afraid. And so we weren't out of the woods yet. It was just this ongoing thing where I just didn't have the support that I needed until finally I found the Motherhood Center in Manhattan,
Mm,
which,
I've heard of them.
yes, they are partial hospitalization program for moms experiencing PMADs, where you come with your baby. They have a nursery on site, they have group therapy, they have art therapy, they have movement, they provide lunch. It was this little haven where I could go and be with my daughter and connect with other moms that were having similar symptoms and challenges, so that I realized I was not alone and that this happens to moms. And I was able to breastfeed. The nursery caregiver would bring her into the group sessions and I would breastfeed, and then she would take her back. And I feel that without that center, I would have never fully recovered to the point that I have today. So I'm,
Wow.
yeah, extremely grateful for the Motherhood Center and highly recommend it to anybody listening that might be struggling with anxiety, depression, other mental health symptoms in either pregnancy or postpartum. They have both the partial hospitalization program for people experiencing acute mental health, and then they also have support for people that are maybe just struggling a little bit, and they can have outpatient therapy and medication management, and
Mm.
highly recommend it.
How old was your daughter by the time you found the Motherhood Center?
I would say she was probably between 4 and 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks.
That is a
Uh,
long time to suffer.
yeah, it was tough. And I still was tunnel vision with the breastfeeding. I still didn't really give myself the grace to feel that it was okay despite all I had been through
Mhm.
to give formula. But I did have a freezer full of breast milk from my time in the hospital, which
Mm.
I was able to give her. So that felt like one thing I was able to take away from that.
And were you aware of the idea of a private practice lactation consultant who could come to the house and help you maybe adjust the plan a little bit?
So we did meet with a lactation consultant before I was admitted to Zucker, and she was able to help me to get the baby to latch. But then as soon as she left, I struggled again.
Mm.
And so it didn't really solve the problem.
She didn't see how much you were struggling and then talk to you about going easy on yourself.
No,
Another
no.
missed opportunity.
Yeah, she just kinda said, "Oh, maybe if you use this nipple shield." And again, the focus was so much on breastfeeding and so not on the mental health of the mother, who was clearly
Mhm.
deteriorating with each
I'm
day.
so sorry that so many people just didn't see you. If you are a lactation professional, I implore you to take the time to truly hear and understand your clients. If they are struggling immensely, getting the baby to latch may need to take a back seat. If triple feeding means they aren't sleeping, it probably is not the best plan for them. We have to look beyond just getting babies on breasts and ensuring that moms are fully supported to feed their babies. And that might mean making a plan B. And plan B doesn't have to last forever. Sometimes our clients need a lactation professional's explicit permission to go easy on themselves until they can feel better. Be the person that sees their struggle and offers an alternative, please.
Yeah, and I find that to be a common theme with a lot of the education that we see and a lot of like the apps that we see that are geared
Mm-hmm.
towards supporting new moms. A lot of it's around the baby's health and the baby tracking
Mm-hmm.
feedings and tracking diapers and tracking sleep. And there's so much, there's just minimal focus on, is the mom getting what she needs? Is the mom
Mm-hmm.
sleeping? Is the mom eating? Is the mom
Mm-hmm.
getting breaks? And so I'm a really outspoken advocate now for focusing on the mother
So
postpartum.
important. It is so important. Yeah, you said that you needed to be eating, you needed to be sleeping, you needed to be drinking. And that is so true. We
Mhm.
cannot take care of another human being if we are not taking care of ourselves.
And that concept of self-care was just completely foreign to me. I always
Mm-hmm.
tell the story of the first day in group therapy at the Motherhood Center when the facilitator of the group brought up the concept of self-compassion. And I remember like hearing it and just being like, I don't I don't compute. Like what, I don't know what that is. I felt like I was like staring into a void of trying to understand this concept and having no ability to practice it. And
Mm-hmm.
what she said is write a mantra of self-compassion and start saying it to yourself. And likely you will not believe it at first, but in saying it, you will begin to build new pathways in your brain and you will start to turn towards acceptance of yourself and self-compassion. And so my mantra was, I am enough. I'm doing the best that I can. I don't have to have all the answers. I am loved. And I would say it when I was crossing the street. I would say it when I was doing dishes, and I would just say it. And that was huge for me.
Low here popping in really quick because this idea of the mantra can be so helpful for so many people, regardless of whether you are in the prenatal stage or you are somewhere in the postpartum stage, or even if your children are a little bit older. I want to recommend a podcast that I'm vouching for because Kelly Smith, who is the founder of this podcast, was a guest on episode 95 of the Milk Making Minutes. She's a meditation and yoga instructor, and she has a podcast called Meditation Mama by Kelly Smith from Yoga for You online. And this is a podcast dedicated to those in the perinatal period. There is one that has affirmations for the postpartum period, for instance, and that is a great place to find some of these affirmations that you might need for yourself in times of struggle. So check it out. I'll have it linked in the show notes. Yeah. Yeah. I often tell parents in my private practice, you are enough, period. You are enough, regardless of the amount of ounces you are producing, whether it's 0 ounces a day or 100 ounces a day. You are enough. It has nothing to do with ounces. Your
Yes.
baby needs you, not your milk. Your baby
Yes.
needs you as a healthy and happy person. And if that means removing human milk feeding from the equation so that you can be healthier and happier, then let's figure that out. If it means doing some sort of combo so that you can be your healthiest and happiest, great. If that means no, continuing to try to increase your supply because that will make you healthier and happier, great. Because for each person, that answer is going to be different. So let's figure out what is going to make you the healthiest and happiest so that your baby can feel the most connected and happiest, so that you can feel the most connected and happiest to your baby. But let's look at this whole equation here and not just the ounces you're producing, because it's way more than that.
Yes. And I think What you're describing with obsessing over the ounces and tracking every feed, it gives us the illusion of control when the reality is we have no control. Our baby is going to do what they're going to do. And I think there's a huge lack of trust in the self to know that you do know how to take care of your baby. You instinctually know what to do. You don't need an app to tell you that you're doing a good job. And I think people will disagree with me on that because I get it. You want to feel like you're doing everything you can to make sure this baby is getting what they're needing, but you can't quantify like the health of your baby at the end of the day. And that was a hard lesson for me, but I now with my son, I don't use any apps. I don't as long as he is happy and gaining weight, that is all that I'm going to pay attention to.
Yeah. When I am working with a highly anxious parent, often I try to challenge them. I come over, I do my long 60 to 90-minute appointment. I do a couple of weighted feeds if I can. And then I'll say all data, the pee and poop data, their weighted feeds data, their growth chart data, everything is indicating that your baby is healthy. So
Mhm.
I challenge you for 48 hours, put away the app and focus instead on learning about your baby, getting to know your baby. Tune into your baby. When does your baby start giving you those hunger cues? Does your baby give hunger cues after 90 minutes? Or is it more like 3 hours?
Yeah. I think what I hear you describing is a, a mindful approach to being with your baby in that if you actually see your baby rather than looking past your baby, you can connect and you can trust that you and your baby know how to do this. So, mindfulness for me has been also a really important thing when it comes to anticipating my baby's needs and responding to what I'm actually seeing right in front of me.
I know you have a second story. And is there anything that you want to share about how the second story differed from the first?
Yeah. So I'll quickly share about my son, Sage. I had him in August of 2022. And leading up to it, the focus was really on what am I going to need? Having had such a traumatic experience with my first, I knew I needed to be really intentional about making sure that everybody around me knew what I needed because that was how Sage was going to have the best chance of being healthy and happy. And so I put a lot of time and thought into a very detailed birth plan. And again, I think a lot of birth plans focus really on the baby and what you want for the baby, and that's important. But a lot of times it leaves out specifications for how you need to be cared for during birth and after. And so my birth plan outlined exactly the medications that I am on and how often I needed them. It outlined a request for prioritizing sleep over breastfeeding, which a lot of the nurses were very surprised at, but they honored that request, which I greatly appreciated. I basically said, if it's between milk production and breastfeeding or me getting a good 3 to 5 hour chunk of uninterrupted sleep, I would always choose sleep. And this is just for me. That's not for everybody, but that was on the birth plan. Asking to be reminded to eat was on the birth plan. Asking those around me to help me ground if I seemed floaty or overwhelmed by offering things that I can do with the five senses, help make me a cup of hot tea or some soup, or give me like something to hold on to that'll help me ground, like a rock or a crystal even, or something that can help bring me down now to this moment. And so everybody knew how to care for me this time. And I didn't go in with a plan for feeding. I said, I'll just see what happens. And again, I had trouble getting him to latch. The lactation consultant, she worked with me a lot, but we couldn't get him to latch. Again, nobody mentioned that maybe it was a tongue and lip tie, but instead of getting so caught up and obsessive about breastfeeding this time, I was quickly able to accept formula as an option. So we were giving him that. So he was getting plenty of sleep. His belly was full. I was pumping when I could, but I had no expectations for myself of needing to pump at a certain cadence in order to keep milk supply up. It was just, oh, I feel like pumping. Okay, I'll pump. I have a moment. I'll do this. So for the first 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, he had exclusively breast milk from pumping, which I feel very proud of because
Yeah.
it's something. And eventually it got to a point where I slowly tapered off the pumping. And then he did have some troubles gaining weight, even with the formula and the bottle feeding. And our pediatrician said maybe he has a tongue and or lip tie. And so we went to see a specialist in Albany who confirmed that yes, he did have those things, which he corrected, and that greatly improved his bottle feeding. But by that point, unfortunately, my milk supply had was gone, and so it was too late to give breastfeeding another go. And I will say there is a lot of grief for me in not having that with him. We talked about instinct earlier, like it's there. I fully feel compelled to breastfeed him, and there is a loss. Sometimes I even have dreams about breastfeeding him, and
Mm,
that's painful. But it's like you can have two things be true. You can hold that grief for yourself and also recognize that for me, that's what I needed to be well
absolutely.
and to care for
Absolutely.
him.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and if I have a third, I don't know if I can do it, but if I do, maybe I'll finally have the chance to breastfeed because I'll know to check for that tongue and lip tie and maybe it would work out. But at the end of the day, I truly believe that fed is best and that the mother's health takes priority because in turn everybody else does better when she's doing well.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that having a tongue and lip tie can impact bottle feeding. And it's great that your pediatrician was aware of that because so
Mhm.
many pediatricians are not. And they can start doing things like, oh, let's switch him to soy formula. He must be allergic to cow's milk protein when it can be oral restrictions that are
Mhm.
impacting that. So tell me then, with all this mindset shifting that you have done, what has that led you into?
Basically, when I went back to work at Slack after all of this craziness, I felt compelled to share some of the really powerful concepts that I had learned at the Motherhood Center with other working moms at my company because I felt that even if they weren't in crisis as I was, they could certainly benefit from some of these concepts. I think working moms tend to carry a disproportionate percentage of the household and caregiving responsibilities, and they're trying to do it all and do everything perfectly. And I felt that offering a space for working moms to be able to come together with other moms at their company to candidly talk about their experiences, their challenges, their struggles was really needed. And so I built this program, which is called Mindful Mamas, which essentially organizes moms at a company into 6 to 8 moms in a cohort. We meet for an hour per week for 4 weeks, and each session starts with a meditation to get grounded and arrive to the space, followed by checking in. So sharing something beautiful from your week, something challenging, and just having that space to take off your work hat and bring your real self to a space where others will share in your experiences. And then the second half of each session talks about a skill for managing difficult emotions, learning to let go of control. And the 4 topics are mindfulness, self-compassion, emotional awareness or mindfulness of emotion, and radical acceptance.
Mm.
And we talk about what each of those things are, and then we talk about tangible ways for implementing them over the week by setting goals, setting reminders. And I like to call it like the non-therapy peer support light version of the Motherhood Center
Oh,
because I am not a mental health professional. I actually am in school for clinical mental health counseling and plan to graduate in 2025 with my master's in that, but I don't have it yet. And so I really emphasize that this group that I am starting is peer support. And there's a big focus for me on providing resources for anyone that may be struggling in a more acute way. And yeah, my vision is to bring Mindful Mamas to other companies outside of Slack. I unfortunately did get laid off while on maternity leave recently, which the tech industry right now is really, a lot of people are struggling and getting laid off. And so I know it's a tough time, but I decided to take that layoff and turn it into something where I could focus my passion. And so, yeah, that's what I'm working on.
amazing. All of the resources will be linked in the show notes, but do you present this? Does an individual bring it to their company or do companies adopt it for their employees, or it could be both?
I think it could be both. What I envision happening is somebody who is connected at the company with perhaps like a parents' ERG or a women's employee resource group could propose this as a program to use some of their allotted budget on to help support moms at work.
Amazing. Yeah. That is such a needed resource.
Thank you. Yes, and I think the idea too is once you've established this cohort, then you now have that as your little pod to lean on after the program. There's a designated Slack channel and you can stay in touch. And I know for me and my healing, having that group of moms to turn to with just questions or venting or whatever it may be was hugely beneficial.
Yeah, that's amazing. Maggie, I thank you so much for sharing your stories. A story like yours, so many people experience it, yet not everyone feels very comfortable discussing it. And rightly so. Each person has the right to share or not share as they see fit. And so I really thank you for sharing that story. And I'm so glad that you got the help that you needed.
Yeah. Thank you. It took me time to be at a point where I could talk about the story in a way that was meaningful. And I do think I'm starting to believe that oftentimes our greatest challenges are what lead to our greatest growth and so much beauty can come from these struggles. And so I am grateful for how it all went because I wouldn't be the person that I am now and the person that I'm becoming. And I do think that, yes, if there are any professionals listening, please remember to check in on the mom. And if there are any moms that are listening, please remember that you are enough. There's no perfect way to do this. The best way is the way that aligns itself with your well-being.
Yeah, so true. So true. It's a dyad. there's a mom and a baby.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever decisions are made have to be good for both.
Right.
Thank you. If you are suffering with a perinatal mood disorder, whether you've been diagnosed or not, if you suspect that your anxiety or your depression is beyond the range of normal, or perhaps you have obsessive thoughts, please tell someone. Or a good starting place is to call or text Postpartum Support International. The phone number there is 1-800-944-4773. I'll have their website linked in the show notes. And providers, it is not all about the milk. We walk a tightrope. We have to care for the whole person, and we have to honor how important the milk might feel to someone while helping them to give themselves permission to see the bigger picture, if that is what will help them feel better. If you are interested in bringing Mindful Mamas to your organization so that people can feel more supported after they have brought their babies into the world and have gone back to work, all of Maggie's information is in the show notes as usual. And of course, if you would like to join a community of people who is interested in discussing why we have so many inequities in milk making and breastfeeding, please join my Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook. And if you know someone who has suffered from a perinatal mood disorder and you think that this episode could help them, please share it with them. Thanks. Bye.